Lovely. I'm just going to stop the transcription so that I don't see myself being transcribed as I talk, which is always really distracting.
For sure. Okay. Well, thank you again, Dr. Tim Summers, for joining me. I really appreciate you making the time and sharing some of your expertise in this area of video game music. Um, you are a researcher, a writer, you host events, you give talks and panels. Um, you teach as well, I think, and assess people. Do you also perform music?
Um, Only for my own pleasure.
Okay.
I'm I'm one of those sort of pianists who says who doesn't say that they're a pianist around other musicians and just says, "Oh yes, I play the piano a little bit." So yeah, I still perform just for my own fun. But no,
Okay.
I'm not a professional performer at all.
Okay, right on. So I am an amateur performer at best, but we at least share this love of video game music, and I'm really hoping to talk to you about how you really first got into that as a research area, how it connects with some of your other interests, perhaps, and other things that you're working on. And then I thought maybe we'd talk about this new book that's coming out that you so kindly shared the manuscript with me. So yeah, so how did you get interested in video game music as a area of research and scholarship?
That's a really good question. I I suppose I've always been interested in media music more generally. I
Mhm.
remember even when I was very young, it must be sort of, 7 or 8 years old, with um, a tape cassette recorder, um, and holding this next to the TV to try and record like the title themes and music of TV shows. Oh, Buck Rogers in the 25th century. Let's try and get the theme tune. Right, and with these little handheld tape recorders. So I've always loved media music of all types. My dad was really into computers at a time when maybe not a lot of people were, and so I grew up around computers. I've always been interested in the sounds and music that they make, and so yeah, over time, I it started as I went through school and started to think about what I wanted to do with my life in the future. I gravitated towards music. It was something that gave me a lot of pleasure. Um, and film music. At one point I wanted to be a film music composer,
Mm.
but then I kind of discovered a love of researching, writing, thinking about music, and it's really that kind of human experience that's always at the heart of kind of why I'm interested in this. What is the music doing? Why does the music make us feel this way? What experiences does it give us? I love these kind of questions. So I'm thinking about these kind of issues. So went to university. Um, there I was very lucky to have people who were really encouraging to me.
Mhm.
And while I'd always had um, been interested in video game music, it was actually a lot of my friends around me that kind of prompted me to really listen again to a lot of video game music. Um, Remember very vividly a friend of mine um, coming into my dorm room with some music.
Mhm.
I'm like, look at this is brilliant music. And he stuck it on my piano. And he said, "What do you think of this?" And I thought, "Well, it's very side playing." Oh, it's very nice. He said, "That is video game music," he says. And it was the opera scene from Final Fantasy VI.
Yes.
And which I hadn't really come across before because we didn't get Final Fantasy VI in the UK.
Mm.
And he was like, "Yes, this music is amazing." And a bunch of other people also kind of prompted me to think, hang on, why haven't I been thinking about video game music? I've been thinking about film music, television. Why not video game music?
Mhm.
So yeah, I was lucky to be around academics. um, I Yeah, the world of academia can be very conservative
Hmm.
at times, and I mean that not necessarily in the uh, strictest political sense, but the idea of kind of slightly resistant to change.
Oh
There's
yeah.
a stereotype and there's a reason for that. Um, but I was lucky to find people who, even if they didn't know that much about video game music, said, "Yeah, this is important stuff. I don't know what this is, but you should find out,"
Mhm.
and was encouraged to do that. So yeah, I decided to then do my doctorate on video game music. At that time, so I started my doctorate in 2009. that time, there wasn't a lot of research, wasn't a lot of writing about video game music. There had been some superb forerunners, people like Jacob Smith talking about Dance Dance Revolution, Kiri Miller, Joanna Demers, and most importantly, Casey Collins writing about video game music, really important pioneers. But there wasn't that much in general out there. I remember people saying to me, "Oh, you want to write about video game music?" I said, "Well, I think there might have been an article about that. Are you sure there's enough to say here?" So yeah, so I did that, and I was very very lucky to find, and I was lucky to find um, university environments that encouraged me. I was
Yeah.
lucky to find supervisors who encouraged me. I was very, very lucky to find other wonderful people to work with, also working on this area. People that I've worked with now for decades, and in particular on the Ludomusicology Society and
Okay.
stuff like that. So yeah, that's kind of the. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
That's
But
great.
that's kind of where I've kind of come from, and yeah, and I'm lucky now to have a job at university where they go, yeah, video game music. Great. Let's teach it.
Sure.
Let's do it. And so
Well,
that's really nice.
I have to imagine that your talks are well attended and your classes are full. I mean, it seems like a thing that does gather and bring people together and inspire a lot of excitement and feelings from students and readers and such. Yeah, I found out about your work through, my main interest is in EarthBound Mother 2, and there are a lot of papers about that and about its music in particular, and then about specifically how it relates to its original game Mother, which like a lot of games, is only available in certain places around the world and in different formats and things. And so it gets kind of into the weeds, but I found your paper really clear and really insightful, and really along this similar lines to what I was interested in with, how does the game use music to get its themes across, to draw the player in, to possibly even teach us something important, like art does. And so I'd be really interested to hear. I mean, stepping back a bit, you mentioned film music, TV shows, and things. How do you feel? Could you kind of briefly summarize how that sort of use of music and media is similar to and different from the way that games use music, specifically role-playing games, but in general is fine too.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's very close to one of the essays that I set my students, actually. So,
Ah,
um,
excellent.
so yeah, it's that's a really, really great question. Um, when we think about media and music, there is a certain amount of shared language there. There are styles, there are musical signs that are part of the language because people who are playing games are watching films, are watching television, are part of the media world that we live in. Video games don't exist in isolation. Um, so there is a kind of commonality of language there, I think, between um, film and television and games. Now, that's not to say that there aren't important stylistic differences, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. But there is a sort of a lexicon of how music and the image work together, and the meanings of audiovisuality. So it's not just the same as music plus image equals. It's more than that. It's those
Mm,
things understood together as a totality. Um, so I think there is that kind of commonality with film. And lots of the people, of course, who work on film music also work on game music. There's a lot of crossover of techniques, of performers, of styles. Um, what's different about video game music? Obviously, you have the challenge of interactivity and how that affects how the music is written. Whether that's loops, layers, stayers, modular, algorithmic music. Um, but fundamentally, for the player, I think it's to do with the fact that it pays attention to you specifically. Not just a generalized you of the audience, but you individually, specifically as the player, um, are engaged with the medium and the music, and it feels like it's responding to you. Now, obviously, that happens really clearly in games like Ocarina of Time, where you play the ocarina, you go, and your characters goes, whatever. But even just more generally than that, in fact, this media is responding and interacting with you. I think is really powerful, and it's that sense of interacting with another thing
mhm.
that is powerful. Does that mean that interactive music is always better than non-interactive? did music. No. Does it mean that you should always have the most dynamic and whizzo music system you can find? No, I don't think it does. But that sense of engaging with something else, I think, is really powerful. So I think that's one of the kind of experiential differences of video game music. To sort of circle back to the question of style, though there are kind of distinctive tropes and topics. I've got wonderful students like Ben Major and James Ellis who are spending a lot of time writing about this, and people like Yuting Zhao who are writing about these kind of tropes and topics that are specific to games. And you look at the work of wonderful people like Thomas Yee and Gregory Rossetti, who talk about like the importance of battle music. What does battle music sound like? There's a sound of that, right? And it's all to do with the rhythmic accents. It's to do with the layers. It's to do with how what battle music, what boss music sounds like. So there are specific kind of tropes. You could also talk about the stylistic language of things like JRPGs. Where does that come from? Heavily influenced by anime, heavily influenced by, and then going back further, heavily influenced by sort of neo-romantic music. Tchaikovsky, Debussy, Rimsky-Korsakov, Rachmaninoff. These kinds of stylistic languages sort of feed their way through, and of course there's all the Hollywood influence as well. So, what's similar? There is a commonality of stylistic language. There's a commonality of the media entity. What's different? The interactivity, and then there are specific kind of video game music tropes and styles as well.
Yeah. So A+ on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I ask for recommendations? No.
You've got a specific term here that I find really interesting. Speaking of like the language of the analysis for this area, diegetic music, right, versus non-diegetic music in games, and so the place this really pops up in Mother is because the quest is structured around seeking out these pieces of a song that has been hidden in various strange places around the world of the game. And that music is diegetic. It is heard by the characters. The people in that world are able to interact with it and ultimately sing it back, right? Perform it at the end of the game to defeat the final opponent and save the world. So I wonder about specifically then how diegetic music functions in an interactive game medium. I feel like this is an important question. I'm not exactly sure why it's important. I hope you can tell me if you know. But yeah, have at it.
Yeah, I think you've really hit on something there, where diegetic music is something really important, I think, in games. And it's something that takes a lot of effort to do often. It takes a lot of planning. It's not, it takes, if you've got somebody performing like in a scene in a game, you've got to make sure things like animations sync up, that it's embedded into the programming correctly, and so it triggers correctly, that the thing's in sync. So I think diegetic music in games does a number of really important jobs. It does the kind of the world building thing of giving you the sense this is. Oops, sorry, I think I lost the signal there.
The world building thing. Yeah, that's the last thing I heard.
Sorry, I think the world building thing is really important.
Okay.
So in a game, when you have diegetic music, it implies that this is a world with a culture, with characters who are performing. Whenever we hear a piece of music, it implies something about the culture that is happening around it. This is why composers who write diegetic music for games or specialize in diegetic music for games, and I'm thinking of people like Ravi Krishnaswamy, who wrote some diegetic songs for things like Wolfenstein New Order and Dishonored 2. He says songs are really important because they can tell you so much, like a really quick shorthand for the world, the culture, the people, and it can tell you so much, yes, in the lyrics, but also kind of the surrounding culture around it. So there's that kind of world building dimension of it. There's this sort of humanizing dimension to it as well. Catherine Isbister, in her lovely book called How Games Make Us Feel, It's a book about basically emotion in video games. Now, she doesn't talk about music, but she does talk about the idea that when we see social signals in games, that we somehow respond to them a little bit. I think music does the same thing. When you see music happening in games, it's a social thing, and we respond to it, and it's like we're engaging it because the music is real, right?
Mhm.
The world. Okay, so Link and Hyrule do not really exist. Really sorry everyone about that, but they are in fact that are not real. But the music is.
Mm.
When I'm playing Ocarina of Time and they teach me the Sonic Storms, Zelda's Lullaby, that is a real piece of music
Mm.
that is really hearing because I can hear it in my real ears. And I learn it and I know the song. It is a real piece of music from a fictional world. So I think it makes it's not overstating the case to say it's transcending realities. I know that sounds overblown and super sci-fi, but it kind of
Mm.
does. And so this fictional thing becomes real for us. So I think perform music is really important for that element, and sharing it when we with those characters can feel really kind of intimate. And the other thing I'd say about perform music in games is it's a moment where all the different aspects of the game medium kind of can come together, um, and you kind of become less aware of the mechanics. You're watching a performance at that point. You
Mhm.
may be, if you're interactive, engaging in a performance as well. Um, and and some other stuff I've done, I've rather perhaps a bit highbrow connected this to some of Wagner's theories about the
Yeah,
integrated
yeah, yeah.
artwork, right?
Right.
Um, and particularly what the famously grumpy philosopher Theodor Adorno says about Wagner. He says, so Adorno, right, grumpy, right? I mean, there's a whole thing about Adorno which we should definitely not get into. But he's like super grumpy and hates pop music. But he says, hey, there's this thing that happens when you have these integrated artworks, and it's like they come alive. And he uses the word phantasmagoria to talk about this kind of moment of enrapture, and he's and that's kind of, I think, what happens in games where you have these performed moments. You look at opera scenes in games that do this, I think, really
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Yes, Final Fantasy VI, Hitman, The Beast Within 2, Gabriel Knight 2, The Beast Within.
Mm.
Fabulous game, totally bonkers, wonderful game. And it has this Wagnerian kind of thing in it, and you just kind of get sucked into it. So I think
Yeah.
that's really what's important about these games. And you get something like Mother, um, and you have these little themes, and you learn them, and they become part of your journey, and you share it with the characters. I think that's what's part of that emotional power of it.
That's really interesting. No, I had heard about the idea of the total work of art and had definitely connected that with what video games are up to in bringing together so many other media, sort of gobbling them up, smashing them together in different ways. Um, but I wasn't so aware of the grumpy philosopher Adorno, so I'll have to check that out and go down that rabbit hole
Brace
another time.
yourself.
Okay.
That's all I'm
Uh,
saying. He makes
uh,
sense. But he hates because he says that Wagner is kind of enrapturing people, right, with this
uh-huh.
process, with this kind of engagement. And so I think that's kind of part of the agenda of games because they want to get you to engage. They want you to
Yes.
believe and invest in these characters. So yeah, totally.
Of course, that's a dangerous thing at times, but it's a beautiful thing, and it's a
Hmm.
deeply human thing. Of course, these games, in some senses, are not real. I agree. The worlds they create are imaginary ones, and yet they are real connections are made possible or facilitated, at least by engaging with them. I think it's a really important creative outlet as well, right? Um, I don't think it's possible to get really interested in games and not sort of dream of, the game that you would make if you could, if you had all of those different skills. And so one other game that I'll throw in here is Undertale as
Hmm.
an example of someone who sort of miraculously was able to do almost all of the elements of a game on their own. Toby Fox with a few, contributing artists, and obviously he steals a lot of things from different places, and he's pretty upfront about that. Chiefly from Shigesato Itoi and his team on Earthbound, and that whole series of games. So Undertale is one that I'd be interested to delve into a bit with you. Um, there are some moments in that game that seem sort of diegetic, but there is always a kind of ironic playfulness that's going on. Well, I guess maybe I don't want to say always, and I don't want to say that in a way that dismisses the kinds of
Hmm.
emotions that that game raises for people. But anyhow, it's definitely a silly game in a lot of ways. And one of the things that he spoofs is the opera scene from Final Fantasy VI. Is very clearly a callback to that. And I wonder about you know, so thinking about playing that game as somebody who knows a lot about music, and you see this opera scene happening, um, and you're familiar with the source material, like you have this firsthand experience of a friend bringing you the music and being in raptures about it. But you also know a lot about Wagner, right? And you know about like good music, classically good music. How do you read that scene? Is it good music? Is it doing something effective in that moment? Is it uh, is it appropriate to say that it is like a gateway into some of these maybe better, performances, or better moments, more serious moments, even within Final Fantasy VI? That's like a more quote unquote serious game, I guess. Yeah. So how do you look at that? I know you have it in your book, so but yeah, thinking
Yeah,
about it.
I think it's great. Yeah, I think Undertale is a really interesting example, and absolutely it comes from the origins of that, and come from Toby Fox doing mods and adaptations of things like Earthbound and Mother. And the music in the game is this sort of eclectic mix of different styles, different genres. If you, some very, very industrious fans have gone through and tried to identify all the samples that are being used, and you can look through the list. And there's a pile of Final Fantasy VI samples in there. You've got some, yes, Earthbound. You've got Mega Man samples. You've got a pile of Mega Drive, so Genesis samples as well. And so what he's doing with that is he's not trying to create uh, um, a specific game as it would be have been on a, let's say, a SNES or whatever.
Mm.
It's a this retro-inspired mix and blend, this sort of
Yeah.
fantasia of different references kind of coming together as part of it. Um, and I think it's a really interesting and very knowing game at that in that way. When you get to something like the opera scene in Undertale, I think what's clever about it is that it works on multiple levels at once. Um, for the so one of the things I think is really interesting about Undertale is how it appeals to such wide audiences, because I get to do quite a lot of schools visits as part of my job, doing
Oh,
outreach and
cool.
all the rest of it, outreach and things. And one of the things that strikes me is I go into schools. I went into a school and there was this music teacher, and she's like, "Oh, video game stuff." Like, yeah, that's kind of my thing. I just like, all these kids, all they want to do is play Undertale. Um, and you can hear in the background. Yes, okay. And you think, right, these are currently kids in what I would, sort of high school kids. So
Yeah.
they're, 12 to 18-year-olds, right? They are too young to know. They wouldn't know the right way to put a SNES cartridge in a console, right? These kids, but it works for them, right? And it connects with them on all sorts of ways. So when you get to the final, when you get to the opera scene, would they know the reference to Final Fantasy VI? Probably not, unless they've encountered it through general kind of online culture and discourse of Final Fantasy. I'm not saying that none of them would, certainly not saying that, but generally I would imagine they wouldn't. But it'll still work for them because it still plays on the operatic, over-the-top trope of these grandiose scenes. You have a character who's the kind of megalomaniac robot who is both threatening and is sort of hilarious all at the same time. The lyrics are funny. It plays off that, the opera trope, right? Standard opera trope, right? We are gonna. That person's getting away. We should go and chase them. Hang on, we're just going to sing about how we're going to chase them just for a minute. So just let's hold on a minute, because while they're getting away, or you're going to die. Great, okay, yes, fine. I'm just going to sing for a really
Yeah.
powerful aria for about 5 minutes before you actually die, and I'm going to wait. This is the ludicrousness of opera, and we love it, right? And so it plays on all those kind of tropes as part of it. So it works on that level, and then it works on the level if you know the Final Fantasy VI, right? And um, I think developers, designers have to walk a very, very fine line, right? Because it can't just be kind of in jokes for the sake of it. It has
Yeah.
to be kind of meaningful. Um, And I think one of the ways it works really nicely is that it creates a connection with the player who recognizes it, but doesn't get in the way for those who don't. If you recognize it, it's a connection between you and the game, and by extension, Toby Fox and Tammy Chang, others who worked on Undertale, saying that we understand this reference point. This is a moment by having those kind of that sort of knowing. Like it's a way of engaging fans with it. So I think it works really nicely as a scene, and all of the music for Undertale I think is really clever. It's highly motivically complex in terms of how it has these themes, which is again is great for cultivating fandom, because people, there are Wikipedia pages full of people tracing these connections between games, and that's been a really important part of its legacy. And how it engages players. So yeah, I think music's a really important part of Undertale. I think the opera scene works. The skill of it is that it works well whether you know it or you don't, and that's why it's so effective.
Yeah, no, I think the way in which not only games inspire people to make their own, but also to get involved in communities online, especially, right, and try to share theories and things they discover and all that. You know, growing up, that was what you would do at school. You'd talk to your friends about the game. You'd have 2 or 3 people to talk to. Now you can just talk to the entire world, and it's wonderful. There's something, I guess, about the sense that it's a reference to something, even if you don't know what the reference is, that I find kind of intriguing as well. And I think again that that's just part of yeah, what sort of structures a genre itself, right? Is like a certain layering of those senses that this is something, and over time they sort of coalesce into what we call, okay, this is a indie JRPG inspired homage game, like Undertale. You sort of like create your own niche within a larger existing thing, and you can sort of peel that onion as much as you want, really. So I think that's kind of a fun piece of this as well. Is like trying to put your finger on what is this object, like what sort of thing is it, and what's it up to, and the humor is definitely a part of that. And the well, the open-endedness, right? The sense that there's something more here. Now, okay, so yeah, please go for it.
I was just going to agree with what you were saying, and I think there's something else there about, well, thinking about what you're saying about the idea of the niche, the genre. It's also how the game announces itself. Because first time I tried to play Undertale, I really didn't like it at all. I really reacted really badly against it, because I thought it was just too sort of self-knowing a little bit. And it was actually once I spent a bit more time with it and kind of came back to it a bit later that I realized it was more sincere than I'd initially thought that it was. And I think that's kind of comes through the way the characters are written once you spend a bit more time with it. And it's not as straightforward as just telling you to do one thing, but you've got to do the other. It's more nuanced than that. So I think what you're saying about how the game announces itself, how it establishes its expectations, is absolutely kind of fundamental to, particularly if you're trying to challenge those genre parameters a little bit as well. How do you negotiate between challenging normativity, challenging expectations in the case of this game, the fact you're the default to kill everything, right? How do you balance that on the one hand versus feeling like you're messing with the player or deliberately misleading them, or something that isn't sort of fair in that sense, perhaps? But I completely agree with what you're saying.
No, yeah. So it's interesting, I guess, to think about, again, like putting yourself in the place of the kid who first plays Undertale and hasn't played a lot of JRPGs before. I guess they are, again, sort of interacting with that object, and not picking up on as much of the direct references or direct subversions that it's doing. They can tell that it's doing something weird, though, right? Like they know that there's something up here. And that game catches on with primarily that audience. I don't think it's primarily people who grew up playing these games who made Undertale such a huge hit, although it appeals to a lot of people for a lot of reasons. But I agree. It's kids, it's people who that is kind of their formative experience, and it's sincere enough. Yeah, and I think a big part of that is the music, right? It's very direct. It's very I don't know, just sort of it's moving. As strange it is to say that. Um, so anyhow, Final Fantasy games, of course, they're an important, I guess, place to notice these kinds of connections as well, right? There's these leitmotifs. There's certain elements like the battle music that you can sort of recognize. Oh, that's what's going on there, and they also have an interesting relationship with different technologies over time, right? Because it is such a long-running series. There's ups and downs. There's you know, the ways in which the makers of those games do and do not get along with the platforms that the games are played on, right? And so there's all that sort of stuff going on. So they're an important, I guess, locus for studying, game music. But I think the EarthBound games are really special, and I want to turn to those now. Um, so you played Mother first. You haven't played Mother 2 EarthBound, or not as much?
Yeah, I'm familiar with them, but I haven't
Okay.
played Mother 2 and Mother 3. They are sitting on my shelf, ready for
Okay.
my summer. That'll be my summer project, I think, is
Wonderful.
properly playing those games.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. So Mother 3 is a whole other thing. Yeah. But the original game, right, eventually gets released as EarthBound Zero, sort of, kind of. In a couple different formats. It's out there. Um, Anyhow, it's a weird experience to go back and play that one, having played Mother 2 first. So I'm interested to see what you think going in the other direction, sort of the proper direction chronologically, and playing them through. Um, because it is recognizably a kind of a palimpsest of the, it's like the same game but not, and a lot of that has to do with the technology limitations, the things they had to work within at the time. um, so so for you, what makes that game stand out? How is it in dialogue with things like Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy, and what's special about its approach to some of those limitations that everyone's working within?
I think there are a few things. I think one of the reasons I became fascinated with Mother is because of where it kind of sits culturally.
Mhm.
Um, because, as you correctly and characterized, that there is this kind of slightly sort of mythic quality around it, because
Yeah.
it was translated but never released, and then then it leaks, right? So then there is a version out there that is in English translation, and it really kind of comes around the same time as the birth of the internet, in that sense.
Hmm.
I mean that I don't mean that in the sense of the literal invention of internet. I mean that's at the point at which the internet starts to become something that is in
Yeah.
people's homes. We
Yeah.
have the proliferation of forums and websites where people are sharing and discussing, right? And so
Yeah.
it kind of emerges at this point. So even when it becomes popular for those of us not playing it in Japanese and not familiar with it in the original, it's already appearing as something from a slightly from another time,
Hmm.
kind of coming through. So that's always really interesting. There's the whole kind of afterlife of it as well, in terms of particularly um, the album of Mother,
Ah,
which is
yes.
brilliant.
Yes.
Um,
Yes, it is.
and it's which is so it's an adaptation of some of the tracks from the Mother game, performed largely by like a rock group, really.
Hmm.
And then you have, towards the end of the album, then you have this version of kind of the main set of melodies that you collect, in a version arranged by Michael Nyman, of all people, who you may know from his most famous stuff is lots of film music, including the piano, which is probably the most famous score. So minimalist British composer,
Yeah.
um, and he but also quite a serious composer. So it's weird to find him arranging this adaptation of a music from a Japanese video game. It's then performed by a string orchestra and St. Paul's Cathedral Choir, who are there for some reason, and it's brilliant and it's quite wonderful. and the whole package is great. And there's this, and there are the star vocalists, and who do the main songs, and the lyrics are written in English on the album as well, which is really interesting. So there's this whole sort of weird sort of afterlife of it as well. So I think that's really cool. But I think one of the things I like about it stylistically, I remember vividly the first time I heard some of the music of Mother. And it's the opening scene, and there's just this little prologue, right? And it gives you this very very simple theme. It's the bum 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 bum, and this is absolutely, I'm convinced, then Toby Fox pays homage to that at the start of the music of
For
Undertale.
sure.
I'm absolutely convinced it's an homage to Mother. And what struck me about it was the simplicity and clarity of it. A lot of the music of things like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest look to Hollywood and cinema music, and there's this sense of adopting those styles. You listen to Dragon Quest, you listen to early Final Fantasy, and a lot of it sounds melodically like it could have fallen out of a 1930s, 1940s horror film movie, right? It's that Corn Gold, it's your Max Steiners, it's your Corn Golds, it's that sort of style of music. It's the fanfares, it's all that sort of stuff. It's all those kind of tropes of adventure music, right? And it's great, right? There is a way that people talk about video game music history, which is common but slightly dangerous, which is they talk about it in terms of, oh, look, we had chips, now we've got orchestras, isn't it great? Look at the evolution along this line. And that's a really dangerous narrative, right? Because it implies that the early stuff is a limited version of what it could have been. Oh, look at Uematsu and look at his 4 channels. Isn't he doing so well? Given his limitations. Imagine what he could have done if he'd had more. Yeah, okay, maybe, but you can't. If you look at this music as always being a limited version of something that it could have been, you're always going to look at it in a negative way. And you don't have to, you can still say, look at the invention, look at the clever techniques, without having to say, look at what came later, or look at what it could have been. You can appreciate it on its own terms. And this is where, I think Mother does really well, because it is deliberately simple in that sense. That's not to say that the music isn't crafted really well, but it's not trying to it's a very different approach than trying to emulate a style from another medium. It's largely, a lot of it are basically kind of pop songs in stylistically. They're fun tunes, right? They're straightforward tunes. They are not pushing the NES or Famicom chip to its absolute limits. You're not getting, you get something like Silver Surfer, which is an extraordinary piece of music by Jeff and Tim Follin, and I play that for I do this thing with my students where I play them Super Mario Brothers, and then I go, how many channels can you hear? And they go, oh, I can find 3 channels in a soundtrack. Okay, how many is this one? And they go, oh, I can't work it out. And I go, it's the same. And they go, oh, how amazing is that? But it's not doing that. It's not doing this sort of, lots of arpeggiation, lots of different sounds. All this. It's not. It's straightforward. It's simple. It's naive is the word that I used to describe it. And it's beautiful. It's so emotionally satisfying to listen to it, and it grabs you. It grabbed me, knowing very, very little about it, just starting this. It's this beautiful, simple, childish in the most positive way music, and it's glorious. And then you kind of have this other sort of afterlife of that music, with this kind of connection with childhood, where the music ends up in Japanese school textbooks. And my understanding of this is that there are quite strict limits about which textbooks can be used in schools, so they have to be approved. And there are only a certain number of textbooks that can be used to have, say, in music classrooms. There are so many, I think there are maybe 2 or 3 publishers that publish textbooks that can be used in these classrooms. One of which includes an arrangement of music from Mother.
Yeah.
And
Melodies.
if you say Melodies. And The copies of the books that I have are more recent, but I've seen scans and images on the internet that I haven't been able to independently verify, but imply that it has been a very long-standing feature. Actually, this piece of
Yes.
music has been used in edition after edition after edition of these textbooks. So it's kind of coming back around full circle. Why does it work so well? Because it's written in that beautiful, simplistic, clear style that communicates so emotionally. If it was going to be, let's do, hello kids, let's do Silver Surfer on Fashions I Live. Possible, right? But it's not. It's this beautiful, naive melody, and it grabs you emotionally, and that's why I think it's so powerful, really.
That's a really interesting kind of comes back to where you're saying, educational institutions tend to be conservative in this small c sense. They want something that is, coherent and maintaining certain traditions. And I think music can do that, right? And it can be a powerful, I don't know, social uh, uh, bond agent of some kind, right? A glue that holds people together. And then it can do this other thing, right? And when you blow up those conventions, people freak out. There's riots, at Hernani or whatever the opera was, right? That debuted, and everyone freaked out and threw the chairs. And you listen to it now. And it's like, it sounds kind of like classical music. So
Yes.
it's really interesting how this is a way to sort of map changes and stability over time and taste and aesthetic, right? There's
Mm.
certain things that seem pretty much set, and then there's blips and there's strange, wild aberrations that happen now and then. And so when I saw that I mean, that blew my mind. I was like, this is amazing. And I started Googling, and I can't read Japanese, so this is just Google Translate. But there's an interview on Itoi's website, his daily thing, where he's talking to the composers of the game. And there's some other interviewer, I'm not sure who it is or what is going on, but they have these like excerpts from email messages that people would send in, talking about, and a lot of them talk about, I didn't know about the game, but I know about the song from school. And
That's
it was like
amazing.
this powerful thing. And then they went and discovered the game as a result. And they're like, oh, this is a great game. So it's this wild, there's so many points of entry, I guess, and
Mm.
so many ways of coming at this thing that suggests that, yeah, it is much bigger than, just video games. Uh, just video games is a very um, uh, misleading thing to even say, right? Because they open onto so many other pieces of the experience, of growing up, of understanding oneself, of understanding art. So I highly recommend checking that out, especially if you
Mm.
happen to be able to get an accurate translation. In that same place, in one of those interviews, Itoi's talking about how he wanted a sort of hymn-like quality, and then he goes on
Mm.
to sort of explain what he means by that. It's very interesting. I don't fully understand it, and again, I'd want a better, non-machine translation there, to get at that. But this comes back to that mythic quality, right, that you
Mm.
mentioned, that these games start to take on, maybe an absence of actual religious experiences for people. The closest thing they have is artistic experiences, maybe even video game experiences, or other sporting events, right? You come together with a huge group of people for a game or a sport, and that's the closest thing to a religious experience. It is a religious experience in many
Mm.
respects. And I guess I'm just curious if you're comfortable sort of going out there, talking about this idea of like the game as a ritual encounter. And I know it's in the context of like museums and stuff, and that's kind of different. But do you think that's plausible, like as a theory? Is it something that people really they need so badly that they find it in video games?
I really like the connections you're making there with the ritualism, and there's also an interesting thing about perhaps repetition as part of that as
Mm.
well. Where video games are repetitious and we kind of expect them to be. That's part of the deal. They set up mechanics. Obviously people complain if a video game is too repetitious, but
Yeah.
we kind of expect to see the same enemies time and time again. We kind of expect to do similar things. We want it to develop and change, but there is a kind of iterative and repetitious quality, which I think is part of it. Yeah, I think the idea of it as a sort of quasi-religious encounter, I think, is a really compelling one for me.
Mm.
There's the kind of community of obviously you can have communities in online games and things like that where it's a much more sort of real-time interactive, we are gathering here and doing a thing together.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's that sort of dimension of things as well. You look at things like the virtual musical festivals in things like Final Fantasy 14 or Lord of the Rings
Mm.
Online, and these sort of things where people come together and create and share music together. But even more than that, talking to other people about their encounters with games, because they are highly emotional experiences. That you can laugh, you can cry, you can become angry and frustrated, you can become elated, when you play games. And I think and music is a huge part of that, and music is a conduit for those emotions, and that it kind of gets us to be honest in ways that we often aren't encouraged to be emotionally honest in our lives and culture,
Mm.
about saying, I
Mm.
love this. Oh, I love that. Did you love that? And that commonality of shared intense emotional experiences, maybe not happening at the same time.
Mm.
But I think that can be part of it as well. The ritualism of repetition, I think, is part of it too, where there's a familiarity, a safety, a joy in that
Mm-hmm.
repetitious quality of it as well. Um, so I think, yeah, games both in themselves and the sort of the meta discourse around them can provide all sorts of aspects of kind of community and almost spiritual engagement. Sometimes it asks. I mean, this is one of the things I think this is really interesting about games, and um, particularly games that have avatars or encourage us to role play in a
Mm.
way, is they kind of take us out of ourselves a little bit as well. It's that opportunity to play with identity. You're yourself, but you're also this character. You listen to people play. You play a video game and you overhear them, and they very quickly slip into the first person
Yes.
about saying, "Oh, I went here and did that and whatever." It's like, no, you've been sitting on your couch. Your character did that. You didn't go through and fight the rules or whatever. But it's because of that sort of
Mm.
taking ourselves, that sort of broad experience. It comes back really to a bit of where we started this conversation about that feeling of engaging with another entity, that sort of
Mm.
response. I think that's really fun about games, and that it whether it's online or through forums, whether it's in real time or not, whether it's through friends in our physical world or online, their games and their music are part of the substance of social interaction. Music has always
Mhm.
been part of human culture. Um, and game music is an important part of that. And it's a tremendously important part of the musical experiences of people in the late 20th and early 21st century, I think.
Yeah. So with that idea of the avatar, and what you're saying about the repetition, I guess the natural place to conclude this conversation for now is with Zelda, I think, right? Mario and Zelda, right? The same composer, Koji Kondo. There's some great work on that that even I am aware of by Andrew Schwartzman, I think, right? He writes about the Mario game specifically, and I know you've written about The Legend of Zelda quite a bit. And that's where your book concludes as well. You sort of come back to this is like the archetypal, game music example, particularly the Ocarina of Time on N64, right? That's the one that most people know and then most people ask you about. But just the way that over that series, you, again, you sort of are, yeah, repeating the same basic outlines of the quest with variations, which are interesting, again, due to technology, due to maybe response to other media and other games. There's the moon in Majora's Mask, my friend recently pointed out, is a lot like the meteor in Final Fantasy VII, right? They're both like this
Yes,
terrifying thing that's coming down to get you.
yes.
And Majora's Mask is wonderful because you actually literally repeat the 3-day cycle like Groundhog Day or something, right? You're just doing this thing. And but music is a key part of those games from the beginning. Um, originally it's sort of like a functional thing, right? And so the warp whistle of Mario is also the whistle that lets you travel around the world of Zelda, right? Which you kind of have to like map out for yourself because it doesn't exist in line anywhere, but it does now, of course. So anyway, um, I guess just yeah, what makes Zelda the thing that most people latch onto, whether they're deep into games or not, and what makes that sort of the great not just game but also music in games example?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. I think I should probably start by talking a little bit about kind of canon and kind of greatness.
Mm,
In music studies, particularly kind of classical music studies, we've been thinking a lot for quite a few years now about the problem of canon, which is to say, like this list of the greatest composers ever, right? And the greatest works of music ever, sort of thing. And there's been a really important work to basically kind of say, okay, so greatest composers ever, and you can Google them, right? And Google will tell you who the greatest composers
yeah.
ever are, and I can tell you who they are because they're Bach and they're Beethoven and they're Brahms and they're Wagner and they're Tchaikovsky and they're all these, okay, and Mozart. And then you start thinking, okay, well, who said they were good?
Mm,
And what power dynamics are at play there? I think,
yeah.
and for the record, I am guilty of this as well, right? There is an issue, I think, in game music studies and um, game, possibly game culture more generally, of perhaps being a little bit too fixated on some of the great games. Now, it's
Yes.
not an
Yes.
entirely analogous situation. Particularly, the racial dynamics are different, in terms of racial diversity and representation in that sense. But there is a bit of an issue, and there's lots of people written very sensitively and carefully about this, and particularly Hyunjin Park and Will Gibbons, who've written carefully about this. So I always have to, when I start talking about Zelda, I always have to sort of challenge myself and say, do we need to be talking about Zelda again? Um,
Sorry.
do we really? And come on, Tim, you must have played another video game that you could talk about instead. So there is this issue, and I kind of defend it, and often I sort of say, well, actually, yeah, I think it is a useful example to talk about, because the flip side is it does have a wide distribution, and these are games which have tremendous amounts of corporate power behind them to promote them and to present them on a global scale. So I think, just from and this is not to be a downer at all, but we have to recognize that part of the reason we all know all these games is because they're made by huge companies and distributed over global scales, right? It's not an accident. So there is that dimension to it, but it's also useful to have a common reference point. Do I think Koji Kondo is a great composer? Yes. Am I interested in trying to say that he's some kind of genius? No.
Mm,
Um, I'm interested in kind of primarily the output that's there and
mm,
the effect it's having on the players. So yeah, there is this thing about why do people talk about Zelda a lot? Well, one of the ones is that it has such an important place in game culture more generally. Um, all that said, it's a game series that has prioritized music in all sorts of ways.
mm,
It's had a good run of games where playing music was an important part of it. We talked earlier about diegetic music. You look at something
yeah.
like Link's Awakening. You've got Ocarina of Time. You've got Majora's Mask. You've got a whole pile of games where playing music is another part of the interactivity. And as we were saying before about being taught songs by the characters in games makes you feel involved.
Yes. Yes.
By giving you other things to play with. There's so much to the Ocarina of Time where it has no game function. There's no reason why you need to pitch bend notes or anything like that, or why you should have a whole set of notes. You don't need them, but it's part of the fun, and
Mm,
it rewards people who experiment with it. So there's that dimension to it as well. And of course, it's music that has had big distribution through concerts, through CDs, through albums, through all the rest of it as well. Um, but it's music that communicates with people. It's meaningful. People are told to pay attention to it in the games. And the musical languages that it uses are carefully chosen so that they communicate widely. Again, going back to that kind of Hollywood influence,
mm,
the music of Zelda does seem to refer to um, things like 1940s corn gold Hollywood music, and that because of the length of time that musical language has been around, both in the 1930s in Hollywood and then earlier into 19th century, where it comes from 19th century symphonic music, it speaks to a huge audience really quite effectively. And then it incorporates all sorts of other influences and blends them together as well. So it uses a stylistic language that communicates to lots of people as well. They're games that foreground music, that present music obviously to you, and it can ask you to take it seriously. So I think those are all factors that make it really powerful. And then there's a whole fan community around it as well, which means that there are continually opportunities for making, remaking, engaging as fans communicate with each other, as even relatively casual gamers will know the theme, and it becomes this other part of kind of gamer culture, more generally, how people communicate with each other. So I think there are all these different aspects that make those Zelda games really wonderful examples and really musically powerful experiences. And even the way the music is implemented in the games, where basically the music's quite loud for quite a lot of the time. So you hear it, so you listen to it. And and Jason Brain has done some wonderful work on this, where if you listen to the themes of the Zelda games, they're not identical.
Yeah.
In fact, the main kind of Zelda theme barely shows up in Ocarina of Time at all, right? Instead, what it does is that it takes tiny fragments of Zelda themes and they come back in different reformulations. So it might be just a da 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 da, or it might be a rhythm that goes da da da. These tiny little elements kind of come back in recombinations. So it's always, it really balances that line between being something familiar and something different at the same time. I was recently playing Echoes of Wisdom, and that does it perfectly as well. The Zelda, it's a Zelda theme, you're getting references to stuff you've heard before in a way that you haven't, and you're getting a new theme that it's new, but it also sounds like things you've got before, and it feels like Zelda for you. And I think that's why they are such great musical experiences for players.
That is a wonderful note to end on, because that's EarthBound, right? It's familiar and it's weird. It's
Yeah.
this uncanny thing. It's just endlessly fascinating to me. And I really appreciate, again, that you have taken time to just share all this great stuff. I mean, so many references here. It'll take me a long time to go through. This is easily a course in video game music, but yeah, I just hope that we continue the conversation, over email and other forums. And I mean, I'm really interested in maybe trying to write something about this Itoi interview, because I don't see a lot about it online yet, and it's not new. So yeah. Anyway.
Sounds
Thanks
great.
again.
Tell me when you've done it. Tell me. I'd love
Okay.
to read it. Sounds fantastic.
Fantastic. All right. Thanks again, Tim. Have a great one.
My pleasure. See you soon.
Okay. Okay.
I'll stop the recording. Stop recording.